let me open up with a question to Thomas. Thomas, you are, we really would love to get your perspective, freshly coming out from the announcement yesterday. Where is Germany's debate on transatlantic security? And if to our speakers, if we could keep it to 5 minutes so we have time for the conversation among other participants. And where do we take it from there? And if you could also give us a couple words about how the nuclear sharing debate has moved over the past weeks. Thomas, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. I want to make 3 quick remarks, one about the nuclear sharing, one about the troop withdrawal, and one about the overall bilateral relations that leads into the strategic direction of those relations. First of all, the nuclear sharing debate that may be odd for non-Germans to follow has a long history. It goes back to the fundamental unease of being the potential nuclear battleground in the Cold War. It is the reasons of the birth of or it's part of the birth of the peace movement. And what you see now is those people coming of age who demonstrated in the 1980s. Some of them are now in positions of political power, that are fulfilling their own mission. And that leads me to the point that I'm trying to make. This is largely and very much so a domestic conversation within Germany. It has a strategic background for the Social Democrats, who have been a junior partner to the Conservatives for 3 out of 4 terms, have no perspective of power except for one, and that is a left of center coalition with the Greens and the Left Party. The one thing that will allow that to prepare the ground for is a repositioning on NATO and nuclear weapons. This will be the uniting bond of a left-wing coalition. It is virtually the only way to come to power, and a social democratic party that is seeing a left lurch. We're seeing the Corbynization of the Social Democratic Party, and the takeover of its 4 most important leading persons, the 2 party chairs, the leader of the Young Socialists, the leader of the parliamentary factions. They're all in this one camp. And what we're seeing, in my view, is a domestically driven strategy. Will this succeed? I think it is fair to say that we should take the defense minister at her word that nuclear sharing will continue to be part of Germany's posture. This will be a very hotly debated, even election topic, and I cannot see conservatives in the country budging on this one. So what you're seeing is the posturing pre-2021 election much more than anything else here. Second point, troop withdrawal. Others can make points about what this means for NATO, and they're much better placed to do that this is a strategy that weakens the United States, that weakens NATO, that does not help NATO to adjust to a new strategic environment in the way it is conducted, and it is not flanked by adjustments addressing current challenges, but that it is framed as an element of revenge against Germany. The president has said that yesterday. Germany is not paying its dues. I would be the first to refute, maybe not that statement, but if framed in a different way, I would agree with it. But I would just remind folks that Germany is at position 17 among NATO countries in its defense contribution. There's 16 that pay more and 13 that pay less. However, there's only one country that this president is singling out for its behavior in terms of defense spending. I think the problem that we have to confront next to defense spending is, we've been talking about anti-Americanism for decades. I think we should start talking about anti-Germanism as a term of trade. There's clearly an element that is directed against this country that has some connection to the facts, but only some. My second point on the troop withdrawal is it will make the 2% debate in Germany even harder, because having this connected to Germany's defense spending behavior will increase how do you make an argument, people like me who've been making this argument for forever and ever, how do you make this argument now with Mr. Trump? Any self-respecting country will say, not under these conditions, not how you're going about this. So I think it is going to be very hard to make the argument that we'll be doing 2% in spite of Trump, not because of Trump. It will change the domestic debate that is already in a state of friction in the following way. We've had a conversation, actually a political debate between the Gaullists and the Atlanticists in the late 50s and in early 60s, decided inside German conservatism, by the way, by Konrad Adenauer with his Atlanticist stance. I think we will, and we are seeing a revival of that. With the Gaullist side of this, we'll be seeing a strengthening with this type of behavior by the United States. This doesn't help the peaceful, what for decades was a peaceful coexistence of these two camps will certainly be more contentious going forward. My third point, I think what we're seeing is the low point of the bilateral relationship that I have seen in the time that I'm following this. Germany, as opposed to other countries in Europe, has pursued, with regard to the Trump administration, a sort of a posture of strategic patience. If re-election occurs, it will be very hard to argue the case for strategic patience going forward. I think I'll stop here.
Thomas, thank you very much. Thank you very much, and your last point on the low point really leads me to the question of what's going on really in Washington D.C. and to what extent we can expect both. Well, one question, Julie, to you is what to make of it, what to make of the decisions that U.S. is taking right now. Thomas pointed out the domestic dimension of the nuclear sharing debate in Germany, to what extent we are seeing a domestic debate. And the other question is, of course, given the upcoming elections, to what extent this anti-Germany stance is a consensus in Washington, to what extent you would expect a change with a Biden administration. Julie, over to you. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you. That was a great start with my colleague Thomas. Fully agree with everything that he laid out there. I'll try not to repeat too much of what he already said. I guess there's a lot of ground to cover. I guess I'll start just with the general, where he ended, and that's with the general state of the relationship between the United States and Germany. Anybody on this call, I think, can agree that the U.S.-German bilateral relationship has not been in a good place for a very long time. I think Thomas is right to point out that this administration has been very frustrated with Germany and Angela Merkel in particular, not just over issues like defense spending, but there really have been a series of issues where there's been friction, frustration on this side of the Atlantic among members of the administration about the trade imbalance, frustration over Nord Stream 2, frustration over Germany's push to maintain the JCPOA after the United States decided to walk away from it. There's a whole host of issues that we could get into, and we're really here to talk about defense, but just to set the table to say this is a relationship that's been ailing, and the part of the frustration by Americans towards Germans, I think, is rooted in complications in our relationship. There are legitimate concerns about not just German defense spending on the left and the right, but there are deep concerns about German readiness on the left and the right. And there now are very concerned folks on the left and the right about this nuclear sharing debate occurring in Berlin. Concerns that Germany is going to move quickly, make a rash decision that will have an impact on broader European security, Germany's place and seat at the table on these types of issues, that it'll upset the transatlantic bargain and all the rest. So in some ways, there's bipartisan consensus that Germany has some concerning developments as it relates to their defense policy, defense spending, defense posture, and all the rest. All that said, no one I know, because I don't know the president personally, very few people in this city actually would support taking those grievances and translating them into a decision to remove US troops from Germany. In fact, what you've seen since the president has made this announcement, we've seen both Republicans in Congress, including on the House Armed Services Committee, that tend to be very supportive of the president, resisting this decision by the president. We've seen voices inside the Pentagon quietly behind closed doors resisting this decision. We've seen people outside of the government resisting this decision. We've heard voices from all over the place. So I think the president is fairly isolated in this particular decision. And I think what he's going to find is there is considerable opposition to it within his own party. And I am not at all sure that this will actually come to pass. The president has talked about removing these troops from Germany by September of this year. These types of movements do not happen overnight. They're extremely complicated. Families have to be notified. A lot of work has to be done in terms of determining exactly where these troops are going, under what conditions. Are they moving all back to the United States and where, or is some of them going somewhere else? How would that occur on such short notice? So there's a big open-ended question here about whether or not this decision will actually be executed, in part because some of what you hear behind the scenes is that the Pentagon itself isn't crazy about this idea either. But let's not forget that the Secretary of Defense is in a bit of an awkward position right now. He's not really in a position where he can challenge the president. He kind of did an about face on his involvement in the president's response to some of the protests here in Washington. So Secretary Esper is probably not feeling like he really wants to lean into this. So we'll see what happens on that front. Otherwise, in terms of what could change if there's a change in administration, I mean, I do think Thomas is right to note that if Trump secures a second term, we should expect more friction, more rocky waters, more singling out of Germany, even without Rick Grenell in Berlin as ambassador. Under a different administration, obviously you've heard Joe Biden talk a lot about restoring alliances and and focused on allied relationships. If you read his foreign affairs piece that he put out a couple months ago, you'll see a lot in that article, a very strong emphasis on repairing some of the allied relationships that have been damaged in recent years, with a strong emphasis on Europe, working with Europe more closely, not only on these defense and security matters, but there's, I think, a lot of work that he has in mind in terms of having a deeper and more constructive conversation about Asia and a whole host of other challenges, including taking our trade relationship and moving it off its escalatory path towards a trade war and seeing if we can reverse course and bring the trade relationship back to a level set. So this all can be a little bit confusing to our friends on the other side of the Atlantic, because you hear Democrats and Republicans expressing concerns about German defense spending. Some will acknowledge that Germany already has increased quite a bit, but then they will express concerns that still Germany's hovering around 1.35 last time I checked, with plans to eventually get to 2%, but not for quite some time, many years into the future. So some acknowledgement in Washington by some crowds that Germany is trending slowly in the right direction, and some interesting developments in terms of getting more engaged in the Indo-Pacific, but general bipartisan agreement that we have to do more to work with Germany to meet those targets and address those very serious readiness issues. We've all heard the stories. But then another split when it comes to what to do about it, with, again, the president determined to kind of punish Germany without any military justification for this decision, and others saying that's a bridge too far. So I think I'll leave it at that. Lots of twisted on this side of the Atlantic, but look forward to the discussion later on.
Thank you very much, Julie. You mentioned resistance, isolation of the president, though the decision has been announced. In the meantime, we have been joined by Claudia. Claudia, fantastic to have you with us. And we'll circle back to you in a second, but let me first go to Warsaw and views from Paris. So Łukasz, I mean, Warsaw has been a bystander in many of these discussions. As Berlin and other allies, Warsaw has not been consulted, but in context of the troops movement, there is some speculations that they could be moved to Poland, and both the Prime Minister, the President, and others have, spoke on this issue. Give us a view of the debate in Warsaw, both when it comes to recent decisions by the US, but also, given your deep expertise on nuclear issues, also the views of Germany and really US-German relations. Over to you, Łukasz.
Thanks, Michał. I'll try to do that, but I think it's important to start with the title of this conversation, which is about Germany's role in allied defense, because this is sometimes, I feel, gets lost in all this negative news about what the Germans don't do and the capabilities that Germans don't have. And I think we need to kind of constantly remind ourselves about a very important role that Germany plays. For historical reason, for military reason, I mean potential, but I also mean involvement in operations, involvement in nuclear mission, yes. The political aspects, where Germany, I would say, is usually trying to have this kind of centrist agenda and trying to be a bridge builder between different groups within the alliance. And finally, geography all of a sudden matters again. And some of the issues around the policy towards Russia, deterrence, mobility, it's difficult to do it without an active support and engagement of Germany. So, of course, we have a number of very interesting discussions with the German colleagues about threat perception, about 2%. Sooner or later, we also discuss Nord Stream 2. But these are the discussions between, I think, friends and partners. And Germany is an indispensable partner for Warsaw, at least from my viewpoint. These are my personal remarks, of course, not the official position. I think the damage around the decision of President Trump is done. And even if the decision is implemented with delay, partially implemented, resisted in Congress and in other places, then there are already negative dimension for the bilateral policy, but also for NATO, and also globally, the image of the US as a kind of capricious power that does things because it can and its president wants to. So yeah, about Poland, there are some voices, I think very limited and fringe voices, that kind of see it as a silver lining situation. That maybe Poland and also other countries from the eastern flank can recover something positive from this decision. But if every cloud has a silver lining, this cloud is a very big one and a very dark one. So the silver lining, even if it happens in terms of any redeployment, is a pretty weak one. And I think a net assessment is that we lose as transatlantic alliance. I would say we also lose in the US, Germany, Poland triangle. But at the same time and in parallel to decisions about Germany, Poland has been trying pretty hard to have more US troops on our territory, more US installations on our territory. There were some initial decisions made last year. There are apparently negotiations ongoing on translating these decisions into actual agreements. So there is in parallel, there has been a process ongoing, and we were hoping to get some kind of decisions confirming the 2019 arrangement pretty soon, but that was supposed to be in addition and not at the expense of the US presence in other places. So the decisions that we are talking about initiated in DC, not initiated in Warsaw, and I don't see that many people cheering on the streets because of what's going on. And the same is the situation with nuclear weapons, when of course no decisions have been made. At least we don't know of any decisions. But actually, you have again fringe voices in Poland that it would be such a wonderful idea to have nuclear weapons on our territory and have our F-16s and soon F-35s being able to deliver the weapons. But if you look closer, having Germany as the backbone of the current model of nuclear sharing and nuclear policy actually makes sense. Germany adds credibility to this posture. Germany, by being an active participant, I think also sends a signal to Russia and others that, of course, it is for dialogue and engagement, but if things go sour, then it can also participate in deterrence and defense activities up to the nuclear level. So this is a really serious signal of involvement, and I think it's being treated as such. So the status quo is much more preferable to the changes and tensions that any radical change in terms of deployment of these weapons in Europe, in terms of changing the nuclear sharing arrangement would bring. Let me stop here and kind of looking forward to come back to these points later on.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Łukasz. So preference for the status quo, and we have a number of people also joining from Warsaw, and we should certainly talk about, how do we move forward given close relations between Warsaw and Washington at the moment. Before I circle back to Claudia, I wanted to go to Quentin for your perspective. Where is France in all that? How does this impact also French views on European strategic autonomy, on relations with Germany, and broader transatlantic relations? Over to you, Quentin.
Thank you. Good morning or good afternoon to everyone. I think what is interesting from the French perspective is that Germany is now in the midst of three great debates in NATO. The first one on nuclear sharing arrangements, the second one on the issue of the US posture in Europe and its in plans to reduce its presence. And the third debate, let's not forget about it, is about burden sharing and defense investment within NATO. All these debates are very specific, they have their history, their politics, their dynamics, but what is interesting is how they intersect and where they intersect. And it points to Germany's central role in the alliance. Łukasz laid the case very well, and I absolutely support this. Also underlying that, Germany is the second largest military spender in Europe today, in continental Europe, at least. So in that sense, the debate about Germany's role in allied defense is not just about Germany and a deterioration of the US-German defense relation is concerning much beyond the two capitals of Berlin and Washington. I think it says something about the state of the transatlantic relationship. I think it says something about the state of alliance unity and ultimately European security. On the first bit, what I would say is the announcement of US troops being reduced in Germany has generated many reactions underlining that US presence was important to NATO, but also benefited as much the US in its own posture as it allies. It has also been underlined that it's not realistic to implement such a plan in such a short time, that Congress will likely not support a move, at least without strong guarantees. But these messages, and I think it's also a point that Łukasz made very well, they tend to ignore the fact that the issue here is not as much the evolution of the US posture in Europe and the numbers. It's about concerns about political commitment that have been accumulating over the last few years. And that's something that cannot be easily compensated by troops or capabilities. I would also say that I think it goes beyond the politics of the current administration. There is clearly, as a European, at least it's my sense, a perception that the rhetoric is evolving somehow in the US about ending endless war, reducing US presence, dealing with much broader security responsibilities that the US has around the world and interests in Asia. On the second bit that I mentioned, which is allied unity, I think the reaction to the debates surrounding Germany have been interesting, and seeing it sometimes portrayed as an opportunity for others to seize, or a sort of logical consequence of Germany's failure to reach the 2% target or something. I think this is a divisive and slightly toxic way of framing this, because it just reinforces transactional vision of the alliance, and ultimately it is something that encourages unilateral or bilateral moves to take place, and that's something that ultimately no ally will benefit from, even if in the short term there might be such a temptation. The last bit, I think, is where Europeans need also to see that they have been slightly naive about the state of European security, and it's certainly true that Germany is singled out somehow unfairly in the debate, because it is a broader European situation beyond the 2%, chronic underinvestment in defense, slow decision-making, levels of readiness and availability issues for capabilities which are concerning. And the pandemic here, the consequence of the COVID-19, is likely to impact further defense budgets in Europe. Just a bit on nuclear arrangements. It is, of course, I think the point was very well explained by Thomas. First and foremost, I think a German domestic political debate. But I think the question for NATO and for Germany in NATO is the consequences of having this debate. And I mean by this that does it amount to saying that, you know, the nuclear deterrence is not required to maintain the posture of the alliance, which I think would be an evolution. It's a conversation that needs to happen if that's the case. Would that be that those capabilities could be compensated by conventional capabilities, and then which one would that be, and what contribution would be made across the alliance? I mean, these are the difficult debates that we need to have at the same time that we engage in more political loaded discussions, because otherwise I think it does not send a strong message of unity. Maybe I'll try to conclude just with a few points that I think make Germany essential. You know, the old saying that nothing is possible without Germany, but nothing is possible with Germany in terms of defense. I think that's not the horizon anymore, and I think we have seen those lines change. And these lines, I think there are opportunities for this to happen. First, in taking more responsibility, the 2% discussion is likely to evolve, especially after the impact of the coronavirus crisis on budget. And this is a discussion, I think, where Germany could take the lead and think of broader ways to think about contribution to allied defense and how it ought to be measured. I think on bridging perceptions also across the alliance, you've mentioned European defense plans. I was honestly surprised to see some analysis of whether the reduction of US troops in Germany would benefit to European defense, or whether it would just be neutral. I think it would be detrimental. I think there is no consideration that there could be European defense without the transatlantic relationship and without NATO. And in a different way, NATO also needs European defense, either for concrete measures such as, you know, military mobility, for instance, or more importantly, the political viability of NATO, of having the Europeans doing more for their own defense, regardless of the framework. And the last bit, which is one that Julie made, I think, is the need to broaden the transatlantic conversation. And this is also a conversation where Germany has a unique contribution to make. What are the other security interests, China, new technologies that allies should be addressing together beyond purely sort of inter-US-Europe relations.
Thank you very much, Quentin. Thank you very much. I wanted to now take a chance for us to debate a little bit within the people in the room on the screen. But first, turn to Claudia, who was meant to be in the very beginning, but joined us a little bit later due to technical difficulties with our Ring Central setup. Claudia, it's wonderful to have you with us. As I mentioned over texting, TKB, Thomas Kleine-Brockoff made also introduction from a point of view of Germany. So over to you, and we can compare the perspectives a little bit, and then if you could signal me other people in the screen, if you could like to jump in. I have Boris, Sven. I also would love to hear from both Ben and Julian and others, but Ben maybe specifically also on some of the capabilities that we are talking about. Claudia, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, and my sincere apologies to all of you for being so utterly late. It hasn't happened to me with. I tried a lot of video calls, and this is the first that really didn't work. So I'm really sorry for that. I'm particularly sorry that I missed the other speakers. And I hear just Łukasz and Quentin, but I missed Judy. So that's the most annoying part, and Thomas, I guess. What I heard from Łukasz and Quentin, I think most of the kind of effects on European defense have been described. So I think I will concentrate on giving a bit more context on the German nuclear sharing debate, and then how this potential withdrawal decision is seen in Germany. I'm trying to be brief, and I'm happy to go more into detail in the debate. So my first point is that the German debate about nuclear sharing is really a party debate that should be seen in the German context. It's deeply worrying, and I spent my time in trying to explain why it's not a really smart idea, but we should really not overestimate it. The debate, I think Thomas probably hinted at, put simply, is that Germany should modify its contribution to the nuclear sharing arrangements, should stay in the nuclear planning group, but put not longer DCA's dual-capable aircraft at NATO's disposal, and it requires the withdrawal of the B-61 bombs that are stored in Germany. So the interesting bit about it, it doesn't question nuclear deterrence, that's all fine, but it wants to reduce Germany's contribution, and it says that it would not change much in NATO and Europe. That proposition in one provocative sentences, I would say deterrence, yes, but burden sharing, no, or nukes, yes, but not in Germany. I'm happy to share why I think it's not very smart, but I really would try to explain where this idea comes from. The idea was launched by the head of the parliamentary group of the Social Democrats in the German Bundestag. That's a junior partner in the current government. The head of the whip, so the head of the parliamentary group, is a powerful position, and Mützenich himself is a veteran in disarmament policies. He was very quickly criticized by many politicians and many experts in Germany. Then he adjusted his proposal and withdrew some ideas, but underlined how important it was to have such an idea. The most important bit is that most of the senior government SPD, so the same party, members, the foreign minister, state minister, most defense expert, openly, very clearly and very strongly contradicted him and underlined that Germany firmly stands to its nuclear commitment, benefit from them, and don't want any modification. So the foreign minister standing up to the party whip tells you something about the inner state of that party. However, the members of parliament not so much involved in security and defense issues actually quite valued those positions. It's important to keep that party background in mind. It's a debate in one political party in Germany, and it is divisive in this very party. And it eventually reflects the power struggle we have in that party, with the current parliamentary group leader, the whip, taking the party to the left, whereas the government members are taking a rather pragmatic stance. And this power struggle is taking place in view of the 2021 elections we are going to have. So the question is this party moving to the left, or is it actually standing where it is in the moment? So there is a clear official government support of nuclear sharing, which is also anchored in the coalition treaty. So put differently, there's no government position or idea to modify a Social Democrat Party, but only groups, for such a move. So it's really, as Thomas apparently said, a German inward-looking debate that did not take into consideration the international, European, and the position and dimension of our neighbor. And it's a really normative and ideological debate between those who claim a peace policy and those who claim a security policy. And I think one weak moment in this debate was really the use of strawman arguments and of very, very normative arguments that often lacked the empirical basis. For Germany, because the German party is preparing the elections. And the one party that was listening silently to the Green Party is facing the same questions. How do they deal with nuclear sharing arrangements or not? And they were very attentively listening to what was going on. And they're also preparing their party program. So it's a little bit a kind of testing the waters moment. Although it seems somehow over in the moment, this debate somehow kind of closed, it's just simmering, and it's likely to come back with other parties too. The problem is that it comes in a public debate which has little understanding or little grammar of nuclear deterrence. So it's sometimes easy to go in a certain direction, to put it in that way. Second, very brief point, the US, the current debate about the potential withdrawal of US troops from a German point of view just confirms how difficult the transatlantic relationship has become and that there's no European answer. There's a lot of speculation whether when these troops are going to leave, or maybe the elections come in first, where they might leave to and what troops are going to leave. So there's still a lot of speculation. But eventually, I tend to think it's not about those troops. It's about the changing transatlantic relationship, and it's a lack of European answers. And this uncoordinated troop withdrawal is just another example how deeply strained this relationship has become since US President Trump entered office. So from that perspective, actually, it's not new, it's not surprising, and we should have known that this is going to come. So I'm still a bit surprised about the surprise in Germany. Trump and many other US presidents before him expected Europeans to do more for their defense. This is not really new. And rightly so, they expected Europeans to do more. And many underline that the main challenge in the future is going to be China. Europe as a strategic problem is more, it's not really solved, but it's less important. So in the transatlantic relationship, what we have been observing in the last years are fundamentally different worldviews and beliefs and policy instruments. How do we see the world between Americans and Europeans? What do we think in terms of policy approaches and policy instruments actually work? Do we think alliances are worth to be supported, or can we actually do it in a unilateral way? Do we think that diplomacy works, or does that rather kind of strong military power politics work, like in North Korea and Iran? So increasingly over the last years, the Europeans and the Americans prove themselves in many policy areas, foreign policy, trade, climate, defense, on different positions. So it's not really surprising. It just underlines how strained this relationship has come. So obviously we could say the US is harming itself and it's reducing its troop presence in Europe. We have US EUCOM in Germany, we have AFRICOM, modern hospitals, exercise places, the Ramstein air base with the drone strikes are prepared. But honestly, if I might say, the US is free to shoot itself in their own feet. That's not, that's their own choice. The problem is far bigger for us Europeans, because we Europeans are not yet ready to politically and militarily grow up and not replace, but kind of try to live up to our own expectations on European defense. There's still no credible European defense without the US. And this is why this decision, or this announced decision, is hurting us Europeans so much. Also because we don't know whether we will be able to stand up together and respond together, or whether we will enter into bilateralization and fragmentation. So this decision is showing that the US leadership is changing, that the transatlantic leadership, the transatlantic relationship is changing, and that we Europeans still don't really have an answer. And this is why we talk so much about those troops, although we have been experiencing this kind of mood over the last years.
Claudia, thank you very much. A little bit on a somber note, to say the least. And then, of course, one could ask about a wake-up call, but we have been getting lots of wake-up calls. I would like to take advantage of the 38 minutes and wonderful people both in the room and in the broader sphere, and ask everyone who jumps in now to be somewhat more brief. On my list, I have Boris, who wanted to jump in on Germany. I would love to maybe then go to Ben Hodges. So if you can, and I see that Jim Townsend just joined us. Jim, wonderful to see you as well. So just let me know if you want to jump in, or many of you shoot me already sent me a note. Boris, over to you.
Many thanks, Michal. I think we've had some excellent presentations here, and I agree with much of what's been said. 3 quick points, or 4 perhaps. Point number 1, there's a lot of legitimate criticism regarding Germany's defense policy, but I think it would not be helpful to underplay what has been done since 2014. The sort of additional spending in real terms is very significant. And a turnaround in terms of defense and building capabilities takes time. I think people are well advised to keep that in mind. That was point number 1. Point number 2, President Trump's decision is troubling also because there was so little in terms of an interagency process, as far as I can see. There was no consultation of Congress. There was no, not even information of NATO or allies such as Germany. And that's troubling, and it's a problem because it undermines support for the alliance. But third point, I think we should understand, and I think Quentin touched on it, that this is not just about President Trump, and that Europeans must be clear that the US increasingly will need to focus on East Asia, and that therefore we need a really serious discussion about what we can do in terms of improving our contribution, and our is in this case Germany as well as Europe, our contribution to security. So the question is what to do. How can we stabilize this? One body that I would be looking to is the US Congress, keeping in mind the letter of 22 House Republicans expressing their concerns about withdrawal. So I hope the US Congress plays its role, number 1. And on the German side, I think what is very important is to bring in the voices of allies, to bring in the voice of Poland, of our Baltic partners and allies, and of others, of France in particular. And in order to have a debate about Germany's contribution to defense, that is not just an intra-German debate. People talking to each other, relitigating arguments that go back several decades. I think we need to keep in mind that Germany is needed. It has a central role in the defense of Europe. And we have to keep in mind our responsibility, especially for our partners in Central and Eastern Europe. And I hope and I expect that we can play a role, including at the Munich Security Conference, to give those voices an opportunity to be heard in the German debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Boris. And we'll go back to also our Central and Northern European friends with Sven wanting to jump in. But I would like to go to Ben. Ben, please, in addition maybe to what you were planning to say, if you could indulge us on one point. I mean, Julie has been talking about the resistance in Pentagon, and knowing very well the capabilities, U.S. armies and U.S. forces capabilities in Europe, if you could give us a little bit of view of what could be the impact and how to minimize the impact, so to say, of the recent decisions. Ben, over to you, and then I'll jump to Sven.
Okay, Miko, thank you very much. First of all, of course, this is a colossal mistake, a terrible decision, purely political decision. It's not the result of any strategic analysis or the interagency process as Boris just described. In fact, it's a complete U-turn from what was happening for the last 3 years in terms of facts on the ground. What the administration was saying was never helpful, but what the administration was doing was actually very good. And just 2 months ago, there was an announcement of a core headquarters that was going to have its forward element deployed to Europe. So to do a U-turn like this reveals, and all the people who were surprised, of course, by this, by the specifics of it. And Claudia's right, this was the mood, but the specifics of it are, in fact, a surprise. Reveals that this was a purely political decision. I've talked to officers at NATO and several other headquarters here in Germany. They absolutely were flat-footed, did not know that this was actually going to be put on them. And I have to say, it's very frustrating, of course, because the administration has a tendency to walk away from anything it doesn't like, any agreements, to just walk away. And I would much rather that the slogan would be, or that the tendency would be, to lead, not leave. Stick with these things that are frustrating, keep working with them, especially when we're talking about the most important ally that the United States has in Europe, and that is Germany. That doesn't mean favorite or most beloved, most important. And these kind of things, the way this has been done, has caused more damage. Now, it was not perfect before President Trump. I mean, even with President Obama, who had a higher rating in Germany than he did in the United States, TTIP was still a huge failure, and things were, there was already challenges, and it does take two to have a relationship. But this administration, with this decision, has damaged it. The 34,000 troops, Army and Air Force combined, remember, that would barely fill up half of Eintracht Stadium here in Frankfurt. I mean, we're not talking about a lot of people. And all the drawdowns that have occurred over the last 30 years took away a lot of depth. So now we just have one air defense battalion, one engineer battalion, one signal battalion, and so on. So a 30% cut of that is in effect a 100% cut. That's we're so thin. And so I'm worried about it. And what's here, of course, is not tank units, or it is logistics, engineers, headquarters, the stuff that is required for rapid reinforcement. So again, we're screwing ourselves on this. This is not punishment for Germany. I think at least half the people that live here in West End will say, see you later. We're hurting ourselves. Now, Germany has a role, has a critical role in the alliance. And I have to say that the German government does a terrible job of explaining to everybody all the good stuff that it is doing. Set aside the spending part. Germany plays important roles, and just think about how everybody reacted when Germany stepped forward to say, we will lead the EFP battle group in Lithuania. All of a sudden, everybody like, oh shit, we have to do it too because Germany's doing it. So that was an example of this leadership. The last thing I'll say is Poland, France, UK, Canada, everybody should be banging on the door of the Oval Office and asking the president, are you crazy? I mean, it's like everybody else needs to be very concerned about this relationship between the United States and Germany, because if that relationship is not strong, then cohesion of the alliance is severely damaged, and everybody will suffer if the Kremlin perceives that our great alliance is not ironclad.
Thank you very much, Ben, and your very tweetable line of 30% of a cut is really 100% of a cut. I think will reverberate. Sven, over to you. Views from North Central Northern Europe. How are things over there? And then maybe I can jump back to to the other side of the Atlantic and bring Dan Fried. I also have Justyna on the line, Alice, few others. So if you can be shorter, we can bring others as well. Sven, over to you.
You can just say Northern Europe, much easier. We are, after all, at the same latitude as Anchorage, Alaska here in Tallinn. But I'd like to pick up on basically what Ben's said. Who is this troop withdrawal punishing? And I would say it's mostly punishing Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, because those countries would need all the logistic setup US has in Germany in order to be reinforced in times of crisis and war. And this is basically we are probably suffering much more than actually Germany would in terms of that capability. I will add some points, basically, as from the perspective of from my neck of the woods here. I mean, the first is that I think in Germany, thinks of itself as an advocate of Central Eastern European countries in NATO. I would say that if you actually ask the decision makers and decision shapers in the Baltic states, they would rather say that they would perceive Germany to be an advocate of Russia in NATO. And I'm talking about the insistence of a NATO-Russia founding act still being intact or somehow alive, like in a zombie state, or Nord Stream 2. When you ask opinion makers or leaders or decision makers in Estonia whom you consider to be your main defense and security partners, I think you will get either US or UK as a first. US because of its nuclear umbrella, all of that, and the military might, and UK because UK does the EFP in Estonia. Then a third country would be, without a question, France. I would say fourth would be Denmark because of EFP, and the fifth would be maybe Germany. And I think this is not really on par with where Germany could be when it comes to a defense relationship Estonia has. So what is to be done in that? I think, or my advice would be to try to disassociate the defense investment issue from Donald Trump, because Trump is toxic in most parts of Europe, and pick it up and emphasize the defense investment in European sphere. Basically, Europeanize the issue, cloak it into a European strategic autonomy mantle, and so forth. Because after all, if there would be no NATO, German defense spending would not be 1.35 or 2, it would be 4% at least. And that would not be enough. And the last point is really, which I think Claudia already brought up, is it's all getting more complicated because of the rise of a China challenge. And basically we are in a situation where in Europe, our main security partner and the main pillar of NATO, United States, is getting more and more obsessed with China. At the same time, we in Europe, we still need US in order to contain Russia militarily. At the same time, and this is basically hopefully also a way forward for the transatlantic relations, the transatlantic alliance, is that the United States still needs Europe in order to contain China politically and militarily, politically and economically. And hence I am very worried when I see, for example, European high representatives always trying to carve out a third independent, hole for Europe to sit in until the US-China confrontation is over. And I kind of end with a old saying that, for the evil to prevail, nothing else has to happen but for good people to do nothing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sven. Thank you for your perspective, and really, I think I would suggest all of us to if you can still hear me. Oh wow. Okay, I think I went. If we can transition into what do we do about it phase of the discussion. So we are not only admiring the problem, and let me turn to Dan for that. I have Dan, I have Julian, I have Justyna, Jim, Townsend, lots of great people. Jump in, Dan. I'll listen.
I was listening to Ben and Julia especially. I was thinking what I would do if I were advising Biden for the first 100 days of his presidency, if we come to that. Just doing it as a kind of mental exercise to look for the way forward. And it's possible. Okay, granted, the strains in US-European and US-German relations have been building for a number of years. They're not simply due to Trump, but Trump has exacerbated all of them. And he's pushed them so far that we're madder at each other than any reading of the actual differences between us would allow. So what do you do? First of all, defense spending. It shouldn't be that hard for US and Germany to agree about general directions, especially in a post-Trump era. Germany has done more, it deserves the credit for doing more, and it needs to take both European defense and its own national defense more seriously. This strikes me as an area that is not a null set. Secondly, Nord Stream 2. Look, I hate Nord Stream 2, always have. And I'm sorry it's going through. It's a real mistake by the Merkel government. But the US and Germany agree about energy policy to far more than Nord Stream 2 allows people to see. Whether it's EU third energy package or a network of secondary pipelines, Germany and the US, or 3Cs initiative for that matter, Germany and the US are on the conceptual same page. And if we could get past Nord Stream 2 or see past it, we would see that. I can easily imagine developing and building on common ground. China. I'm astonished by how fast the Chinese have gone from being seen in Europe as a problem-free source of investment to a big problem. There are differences about China, but there is something to be built on here. Mixed signals from the EU, but generally the EU is moving in the right direction, recognizing, and NATO is recognizing that China is a strategic problem. I can see that becoming an area of converging interests. Trade, big differences. But if you think of trade and start with trade as supply chain issues, then suddenly you have a large element of common ground and the political basis to do something that doesn't evoke the bad politics of trade agreements in the United States. Frame it in terms of supply chain issues and financial transparency issues, which gets at Russian dirty money and Chinese hidden investment flows. Now, this is a sketch, admittedly, but I was trying to think of what the Biden message would be. Or, if Trump, unlikely, but if Trump decided to do what George W. Bush did in his second term, which was a major pivot and an attempt ultimately successful to reconnect with Europe. I don't think Trump will do it, but he could. Like I said, he won't, but he probably won't, but he could. There's a lot of substance. The United States is going to have to acknowledge that it was picking fights with Europe for no good reason. Europe is going to have to acknowledge that it needs to do more. It needs to step up. We can't go back to some golden era. We have to move forward. And I sense that a look at where Trump is driving the transatlantic relationship in the free world is frightening enough that there is a potential political basis for a positive agenda. Now, look, you may see this as too optimistic, but the policy world has to be governed by realism, but also a sense of the possibility. Or why don't you just go into academics where you can write all the doom and gloom you want? Anyway, there's more to say, but Michał, you asked me to be brief.
Thank you very much, Dan. Continuing on what should be done, let me turn to Julian and then Jim, and then I would like to come back on this side of the Atlantic. Julian, you are sort of in between, I guess, and think also about the effects that these discussions are having in Poland and also in France. Julian, over to you, and then Jim Townsend.
Thank you, Michał, and I will keep this brief. I learned this morning that a senior British officer is going to Brussels to start work on a strategic concept, which was interesting. And I would suggest to you that this is a big moment for people like ourselves to start working on something like that, because we need it. We need it very, very clearly. We need to reset the transatlantic strategic contract. And there is no such contract without a special relationship between the US and Germany. Face up to it. It's just fact. If that doesn't exist, then we can all effectively go home. Therefore, I think timing is vital. November particularly. One, we have to all recognize the depth of the problems that we face. We have to understand what is political and what is strategic, and identify where we can do business. To come November, we either must seek a reset or a restart, new start to the relationship with the US and Germany to the fore, and if President Trump has a second term. All we Europeans, as Ben suggested, have to put pressure on the White House to embark on such a reset stroke new start, because it's critical. Michał, you briefly asked me to talk about my own country, Britain. I heard what Sven said about the FP, but the Brits don't care. It's a house divided against itself increasingly. It's withdrawing behind its nuclear shield. It's withdrawing from the continent. The bulk of its forces. What it is spending on is maritime amphibious, Dreadnought class ballistic missile submarines, Astute class nuclear attack submarines, the two new 70,000 ton plus aircraft carriers, and the new frigates and destroyers that we're building. The message is clear. Britain's becoming a maritime amphibious power again, an offshore power, and is going with the Americans. And brings me to my central point, which is, for all this to work, Germany has got to develop a clear vision of itself as the focus of the continental defense of Europe, much as it was for much of the Cold War with the support of the United States. And until Berlin has that sense of that role at the center of an truly adapted alliance and a union, driving forward the European defense debate as it must, but willing to go those steps, not simply to say we're spending 2% or whatever, 1.35% on GDP on defense, but what is the nature of the threats that we're facing? The digital, the hybrid, the cyber, as well as the high-end potential military conflicts. What is the shape of the defense that Europe will need in 2030, 2040? And what is Germany's role as the hub, strategically, politically, financially, even technologically, in helping to shape that future European defense? If Germany can have that debate, then the rest of us can move on. But until Germany has that debate, I fear much of the discussion is academic, which is, I'll conclude with my specific recommendation. If we really are going down finally the road of a strategic concept for the alliance, and it's going to be a complex story we know, then surely an organization like GMF should bring people together, and we can try and draft what a strategic concept for the 21st century should look like, built around the essential stroke special US-German relationship, which will be at the core of any credible defense and deterrence posture. Michał?
Super. Thank you very much, Julian, and thank you for very specific idea also for the group very much in the room, because this is really the people who who are thinking about it and should be thinking about it as well. And may I just add also to put a plug for Julian, if you want to, for everyone in the watching it, if you want to read more about it, Julian is just coming out with a book on the future of war and really how the
Brilliant and very reasonably priced.
Very reasonably priced, beginning of 2021.
Yeah.
Jim, over to you, and then I would love to jump into also to Justyna and Alice and Marcin on this side of the Atlantic. Jim, anything you wanted to address, but I think it would be very interesting to hear from your response to this idea of resetting transatlantic contract and what would be the conditions necessary on the American side.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Is this coming through? Good. I would say I'm sorry I'm late, but I've actually been part of this, but I've been bouncing around between satellites, and I think I've just finally arrived. So it's great to hear you all. Just a couple of points, including your point as well about the bargain. And these might have been said earlier. I was kind of going in and out. So first of all, very early on, Thomas talked about anti-Americanism and an anti-Germanism as well, if you will, between the U.S. and Germany. We cannot let that happen. This is not a tussle between the German people and the American people. It's politicians, it's some experts, but if we allow the rhetoric to infect our people during these election days, then we really are in trouble. There's a foundation of great relationships between the German people and the American people. We have to make sure that the politicians don't infect that and weaken that. The second point is that just to say about the readiness problem that Julie raised and the whole burden sharing thing, no matter what happens in November, that's going to be a problem we're going to have to work on. But I'd like to suggest a point to help us work on this issue of burden sharing. And frankly, it's the title of this event today, and that is the role of Germany. I think we have got to get into something in terms of thinking about a division of labor between the Allies, and I have fought that for many years. There's been in various contexts about having a division of labor. But what I mean by that is that we've got to figure out, in terms particularly of the United States to start off, what do we see in terms of our role in Europe and what do we feel we need to have in Europe to do this? And I guess that gets to threat. It gets to what Julian was just talking about, a strategic concept, because we do have to figure out what kind of forces do we, the United States, or other allies need to have in Europe, and that can help us better define what we want Germany to do, what Germany's role is. We use the 2% metric as a way to try to give a goal for nations to get at, but this doesn't work anymore, because we need to be more specific about what do we want Germany to do, and therefore that's going to define what kind of forces they need, etc. NATO is supposed to do that through defense planning and force goals and that type of thing. But I think going to the question you want me to address and what Julian raised is, we've got to have a better idea of what of a strategic concept to give us this guidance so that we know better what our role should be and therefore what we need to spend to fulfill those roles. But what I will say to Julian is, if a Brit has now gone over to start talking about that, I hope it's just talking about the concept, the idea of it. I don't think we're starting to talk about it in any formal way in terms of the new strategic concept. But I think the point should be made too that it's not just the document itself that's produced. I have a feeling not many people read the document once it's been agreed. The importance of a strategic concept is the process that all the allies go through to write that document. That's where, through endless meetings, we hammer out what we see as a threat and how we feel we should address it and what the roles of the nation should be. So in terms, and I'll end here, in terms of addressing the issue that we have today, we're going to have a new strategic concept. We're going to have that process, to go through that process to figure it out what the roles will be. And once we do that, I think we're going to have a better idea of what the individual allies need to be doing. The U.S. will have a better idea of what we will or won't be doing in Europe, and thereby giving the European allies a better idea of their roles, particularly Germany, which leads in Europe in terms of the military capability, and gives Germans a better idea of what they need to have in terms of a capability and how much money they need to spend. So we've got to start at the top, and we've got to work our way so that we can have a division of labor that makes sense. But we want to start it after November. Let's don't start it before. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jim, on division of labor, I think that's absolutely the key question. Before, you mentioned November 2020. Before the November 2020, we in Poland have June 28th, 2020, and I wanted to turn to Justyna, not to speak directly about our presidential election, but the division of labor that you in Poland would like to see, but also the politics that it's creating on this side of the alliance. Justyna, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Michał, and thank you for all the voices in the debate. Very interesting. I just want to underline that all these recent developments and debates are met with great concern in Poland, in Warsaw, even if this is not seen abroad. I think that the realization came that strengthening bilateral relations with the US without a broader context is not leading us to more security, but to less security. From Warsaw perspective, all these debates in Germany about nuclear sharing, the decision on withdrawal of US troops from Germany, I think this is met with an understanding that we are faced here on the eastern flank with a disintegration of Western security structures. And this is very worrisome, and the effects of it in Warsaw, we are having debates among some certain experts on developing Polish nuclear weapons. So these are discussions that show how much concern, how much uncertainty we have in Poland with all these developments. But I would like to say a few words on a positive note, and what can we do? I think that Eastern flank countries, Poland especially, after realizing that not strengthening bilateral relations without having strong transatlantic West European, German, US relations is not increasing our security. The way to help it, somehow to help in these transatlantic discussions, it would be to have a stronger Polish-Baltic voice in Washington on these issues, stating that strong US troops presence helps our security as well. I think we need a stronger Polish, Baltic, Nordic voice also in Germany. On Germany, saying that Germany is crucial and central also to our security, and we need to work especially with the parties that supposedly will win the next parliamentary elections, especially with the Greens. And I think we need to have a debate in Europe and in the EU, especially on what the European defense means. And I don't think we have this debate yet. We have the opposite. If we look at the discussions on the multi-annual financial framework and the money being cut for military mobility, if we look at the strategic compass that under the German EU Council presidency is to be discussed, we see that there are no discussions about tackling the issues of collective defense in the EU framework. And I think we can do more within the EU tackling these issues and cooperating with NATO. And the military mobility is only one of the elements. And I think we can have also a strong Polish, Baltic, Nordic voice in the EU on these issues, since we haven't had it until now.
Thank you very much, Justyna. Let me bring on this point Marcin Wróblewski from the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but I would say everyone here participates in private capacity, and since Polish nuclear bomb was mentioned, will not put you entirely on the spot. Marcin, over to you. And if anyone online outside of our room has further questions, I'm receiving some, do let us know, but we have to bring it to a close very soon as well. I have Marcin and Alice and a few others who I might not be able to get to. Marcin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michał, and thank you to all for very interesting thoughts and views. And it's very difficult not to agree with everything what has been said here, except maybe for this Polish nuclear bomb we are not planning to construct, so to assure you. But of course, any frictions on both sides of an Atlantic are detrimental to our security and our interests, which is very obvious. And US presence in Europe has not only military meaning, but also political. And the same goes for the nuclear sharing. So this is even more, I think, of political nature than the military one right now. And it is key that Germany remains in the nuclear sharing. As for the Germany role in the defense and of the eastern flank, it has been said already. So not to repeat the role of Germany. And let me also address the elephant in the room, which is, I think, U.S. presence in Poland. So, and this is, let me put this very straight. This is not at the expense of Germany. And the parallel work is going on for quite some time in the implementation of the presidential declarations. And we see it as a additional reinforcement of US troops in Poland than just simple shifting from Germany to Poland. This is not the case. And what shall we do? This is also something which was asked here. So I agree that we should talk to in Washington on the necessity to provide robust forces in Europe, but also we should do our work here and in Europe. And I fully agree with Justyna. So, which is worrisome when it comes to the financial perspective for the EU defense, and when it comes to mobility, it's a very worrisome for us, so that we may not have enough money for this. And one thing I think is strategic communication. We are very much missing in Europe, and which is to explain to public opinion, not maybe in Poland, but in Germany, that why the Atlantic link is still important, and that we refrain from very simple anti-Americanism, which is quite spread now in some European countries. So this is also what we should bear in mind, and we should use think tanks, discussions like this in a wider public, explaining that this is something we should avoid. And I hope it will not bolster the proponents of withdrawal of US nuclear weapon from Germany. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcin. Let me go to Alice now.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for just giving me a couple of minutes to react. Just one quick point on the troop withdrawal question. So we don't know yet if those troops will be removed, and if they are, from which bases, right? And it's really important to note that it's not only about territorial defense for Europe, it's also about the US and Europe's ability to engage in the Middle East and Africa. The Ramstein air base was used during the Libya operations, and so there might be other things at stake beyond just the eastern border if the US does withdraw. And 10,000 troops, if they withdraw 10,000 troops, it's just as many as the whole of the French troops deployed across the globe today. So even though Ben Hodges suggested that it's not that many, it is actually a huge number compared to existing European expeditionary military forces, for example. But my point is mostly on the nuclear sharing question and what can we do, your question about that. I'm thinking about the industrial dimension of nuclear sharing. You know, there is this whole discussion between France and Germany about the future combat air system, which is supposed to be nuclear capable. And I'm wondering to what extent having this investment in German defense industry could facilitate the debate within Germany for investing in the future of nuclear sharing. And going through the industry, going through Europe, for example, using the European Defense Fund as a vehicle for leveraging some funds for funding the future combat air system, for example, which is supposed to be nuclear capable, could be a way perhaps to facilitate, even for the left, even for the SPD, the decisions to procure those aircraft, which are supposed to be, the decision is supposed to be made in 2021 to develop those aircraft. And that justifies not investing in the US F-35, which is expensive, which is not Germany made, and still to invest in those strategic capabilities that are nuclear capable. So I'm wondering, yeah, to what extent this dialogue with France and this collaboration with France on defense industry can be a way for Germany to sort of get on at least some of the aspects about the nuclear sharing issue, which is the cost of procuring American aircraft, for example. So that's just throwing an idea out there, but it would have been great to hear back from perhaps some German observers about whether this industrial dimension can be something to put in the balance on the positive side for the future of Germany's participation in the nuclear sharing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are really coming to the very end, and I apologize to Artur and Martin, who have been also wanting to jump in, but I'm mindful of everyone's time and having to jump off as well. Maybe what I would, well, first of all, we should certainly continue this, but maybe I would like to turn to Julie and Claudia for really the two key, well, representing the two key countries. Julie, to you, if you had to pick anything from this discussion that you think should stick also past November 2020, and Claudia, to you, I mean, so much has been so much effort and emphasis has been put on the need for Germany to also conceptually get its act together. If you see a way forward on this after your, well, either in this or next term, and perhaps we can with the two of your voices chart a little bit of a way forward for this dialogue with others really in the room and other countries, especially Poland and France. To what extent we can support you in this, as clearly your relationship is key for us. So Julie, over to you, and then Claudia for our final intervention.
Well, thanks. Just two really quick points. Back to what Boris said, ensuring that Americans acknowledge some of the changes that have been made, the investments that have been made since 2014. I mean, I agree with Boris when he says, and others mentioned, that Germany isn't always best at messaging some of the things that it has been doing. I think there's a lot of mythology and misunderstanding about what's happening. I think there's still some folks in Washington that are completely unaware of what's happened since 2014 inside German defense spending. So point one is Germany and allies of Germany, including those of us in the United States, but other Europeans, could probably help the cause by having some more public engagements, particularly with members of Congress, but also more visible media engagement on this, I think would be very helpful. Not to say that we don't have to acknowledge that more progress is needed, but I think we can talk about what's happened to date. And then the second point about kind of bringing in other allies into this debate, I think it would be helpful if we heard from other countries in Europe about their perceptions and feelings about this proposal by President Trump to remove US force posture from Europe. This is a decision ultimately, as we've all discussed here that will have an impact on European security, transatlantic security writ large. This should not just be a discussion about Germany and the United States. I think it would be helpful if other countries also came forward and said, look, we acknowledge there are issues here. We too would like to see our friends in Berlin do more when it comes to defense, but let's talk about what's been done and how we can get from A to B without taking extreme measures. I think that would be helpful and would arm some of the folks in Congress and across Washington that want to be helpful in this regard and push back against this decision to ensure that it doesn't actually happen come September, and that we could delay it until perhaps we get another team in the White House. I think all of that would be quite constructive. But thanks for this. This has been terrific. It seems like it's just an opening act. I think we could go another round with this crew. It's a great group. And as Julian noted, there's plenty more work for us to do, whether it's debating, you know, the pros and cons of putting different aspects into a new strategic concept. There's lots of things that this group could be doing. So I hope it continues.
Thank you very much, Julie. Thank you very much. Claudia, over to you.
I totally agree with the opening act, Julie. So I think this is really something that should be continued. And I like also having two women having the final words, if I might say. Two very quick points. I totally agree on Germany needs to message better. We need to be, as Germans, more committed, and we need to have more allies on board. Totally agree. But my second point is that there was a lot of Germany has to spend more, Germany should do more, should live up to, Germany is central. I agree on all that. But in the same time, that's a very normative statement. This is what I have been suggesting, what many of us have been suggesting. But the question is, does it relate to the reality in Germany? Shouldn't we not try to link our recommendations much more or much better to what the German reality is? Yes, since 2014, lots of things have happened since the famous Munich Security Conference. And yes, there was change. I'm the first one to defend that. But I would also say it was too little and too late. And normally we say strategic cultures, so the way a country behaves in secure defense takes about a generation. This is not going to happen overnight. So the first is, do our recommendations link to reality? I would personally put a big question mark. The second question I would ask, and this is why I would say next to the ideas we mentioned, we should direct our thinking towards that. What do we need to change this German debate maybe a bit quicker, if I might say, to speed up the change of a strategic culture? I know, big task, but where do we actually need to change stuff? Where do we need to start to make things change in Germany? So not only say we need to be more committed, I'm the first one to subscribe, but how do we get that into the German debate so it really happens? And the last question I would kind of encourage us to think about, and what if it doesn't? I mean, most of us, we have been observing German security and defense policy for a while. Many good things happened. Many unpleasant things happened. I mean, the nuclear sharing debate, for me personally, you know, that was not wonderful. So the question is, what if all this normative we should do, we have to, we will do, is not happening? What is our plan B? So I think what could be interesting in intellectual terms could be to think a bit more in scenarios and to think about where do we need to start. Yes, I think Julie made that point. We need to work more on Congress, or in our case, on Parliament, on the public and all that. But what if, you know, it doesn't? What if you could put the what if even in other directions? What if I might say so, Quentin, the French, or Martin, the French elections, you know, turn out differently than most of us hope? So let's do a bit of what if to keep us intellectually agile.
Claudia, thank you very much. I'm not sure if it was the best idea to, no, I'm just joking. Of course, this was, you are leaving us with food for thought, but I do have to say that looking from Warsaw perspective, the plan B looks pretty bad. And not to make too fine point on this, there is a world in which also in other countries, voices that are very marginal can become more central, because Plan B looks so tricky. And I see Justyna nodding yes, and we are talking about the same thing. I wanted to thank you all for this very thoughtful, sobering, fantastic discussion. I take from it that, you know, I think our role is to be a little bit of this, you know, normative, as a group of people who are advising, pushing our strategic cultures in the right direction than in the wrong direction. But there is clearly plenty of work ahead for us. And certainly if November 2020 goes one way, if Poland goes another way, if France goes third way, Germany fourth way, we might have much more of a work to be done and a really difficult Plan B. And I would encourage us not, you know, to continue this work. And certainly I wanted to thank colleagues from Paris and Berlin and also in Warsaw here, Monica and Marta, for putting this together. But we'll be back in touch with you to continue this discussion and come up with concrete ideas that we can then have our colleagues in the government implement, maybe at slightly better times as well. Thank you all in the room. Thank you all for those who were watching us online. Fantastic to have you with us, and see you next time. Thank you all. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Many thanks.